Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Peppis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Peter Walker, Professor of Geography and Environmental Studies at the University of Oregon. Walker's interests lie in the social and political dimensions of land use planning with focus on the American West and Southern Africa. He's the co-author of Planning Paradise, Politics and Visioning Land Use in Oregon. Walker spent 5 weeks going back and forth between Eugene and Harney County to witness firsthand the occupation of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, January 2nd through February 11th, 2016. Thank you, Peter, for coming on the show.
My pleasure.
First of all, what sparked your interest in public land use in the western states and in Oregon? How'd you get there?
Well, it's a huge issue. We have in the western states, the majority of the land area is publicly owned, and the United States is unique in that way that we have such a large endowment of public land that belongs, in a sense, every American is born as co-owner of a very large estate of land. The question always comes up, well, to what end, for what purpose, for whom? Why do we own that land, and who should benefit from it? And that obviously is a very political question, and has become more so over time as the culture has changed, and we want things different than just mining, ranching, logging, and so on. That maybe that's how the land was used primarily at one time, but now we're concerned about things like habitat protection for endangered species and so on. So on the public lands, we're much more aware of the tensions that are inherent in this collective co-ownership of the public estate.
So tell us, what are the issues that led to the armed standoff at the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge? What was at stake there? Why did it happen?
Let me start by saying something that I think hasn't come out in the general media, which is that I think that there's been discussion about, well, the takeover of the Malheur Refuge was about giving the refuge to the county, to farmers, ranchers, and so on. That was part of the story. But in fact, there was a bigger political agenda. And essentially what that agenda is an effort to, without mincing words, to overthrow the federal government of the United States as we know it. It actually started, in a sense, I think you can't talk about the Malheur occupation without understanding what happened in Nevada 2 years earlier. The father of Ammon and Ryan Bundy, the leaders of the Malheur occupation, Cliven Bundy, had chosen, largely I think for ideological reasons, to refuse to pay his grazing fees on public land, which are very minimal. I mean, even ranchers generally agree that the fees that ranchers pay to the BLM or the Forest Service or other federal land management agencies are actually quite reasonable. But Cliven Bundy made a decision, for whatever reasons, that he was opposed to federal ownership of land in general. And in a sense, what he said to the federal government is, you don't own this land, I do. And he has a theory behind that his ancestors settled in that part of Nevada and staked a claim under the principle of prior appropriation, first in time, first in right. And I think he decided that he was going to take a political stand by not paying his grazing fees. And in doing so, he was making a larger political statement. In essence, the statement was that the federal government, in his view, doesn't have the right to own land outside of, and this comes directly from the exact text of the U.S. Constitution, word for word, although many generations of legal scholars, including the Supreme Court, would beg to differ. But what Cliven Bundy argues, and what many of his sons argue, and the supporters of their movement argue, is that the federal government does not have the right to own land outside of 10 square miles in Washington, D.C., which is it's Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 of the Constitution, what's known as the Enclave Clause. Many generations of legal scholars, and as I said, the U.S. Supreme Court on multiple occasions, has taken up that issue and said, in fact, other parts of the Constitution, particularly what's known as the Property Clause, in fact do give the federal government the right to own property outside of Washington, D.C. Cliven Bundy and people like him don't agree with that, and they essentially chose to take a stand against the federal government. And their ideology, as I understand it, and I've heard Ammon and Ryan Bundy, for example, say this. I was standing a few feet away in the same room. And essentially what they argued is that once the federal government, in their view, oversteps its constitutional authority, it's no longer our government. That government now is an unconstitutional entity that's abusing its authority, that's overreached its authority, and that according to sort of American Revolutionary War era ideology, and they often cite Thomas Jefferson, for example, saying that when the government oversteps its authority, it's no longer your government, and it's the duty of patriotic Americans to oppose that government and to reestablish a government that is, in their view, constitutional. And so I think it's really important. This is not something I think that really came out clearly in the press coverage of the Malheur occupation. Cliven Bundy in 2014 in Bunkerville, Nevada, was in a sense attempting to launch a nationwide political revolution against the federal government. And he did so with arms. He called for militia, so-called self-described patriots, to come from all over the country, and they did. And they pointed guns at federal Bureau of Land Management agents who were attempting, basically after 20 years of Cliven Bundy refusing to pay his fees for grazing on public land, they were going to impound his cows. And Cliven Bundy, in my view, saw that as an opportunity to take the kind of political stand that he wanted to take and make a very dramatic statement, which it certainly was, where these outside militia patriot groups literally pointed guns, high-powered military-type guns, at Bureau of Land Management employees and said, essentially, if you take these cows, we're going to kill you, and we're going to start a political revolution. The Bureau of Land Management wisely chose at that point to withdraw, and Cliven Bundy essentially went without any kind of paying any kind of penalty for that action for 2 years. And he felt that he had won. And the lesson that he took away, and his sons at Malheur in Harney County specifically said, was, you see, and I'm quoting them, that if we point guns at the federal government, the tyrants in their view, the abusers, the unconstitutional federal government, that they'll back off. And up to that point, that is in fact what happened. And people have asked, well, why didn't the federal government go and basically arrest Cliven Bundy and all of his co-conspirators at Bunkerville who had pointed guns at federal agents? And the answer, you can answer that with one word: Waco.
Is the answer.
That people remember what happened in Waco, Texas in the early 1990s. People also talk about Ruby Ridge, Idaho, another case where there was an armed confrontation between federal authorities and people who were ideologically opposed to those federal authorities, and people died. And I believe the federal government, the FBI, the Bureau of Land Management, remembered Waco and remembered Ruby Ridge and chose to take a very slow approach. And people asked, well, why aren't you going after Cliven Bundy? Why aren't you going after the militia who pointed guns at federal agents, which is obviously illegal? And the answer is because they did not want a bloody confrontation, and it was very clear that those people, there were many people present at the Nevada Bunkerville standoff who would have been prepared to die in a bloody battle had the federal government pushed it further. Some of the people who were present, for example, at the Bunkerville standoff later actually they decided that what happened, and when the federal government chose to back off, that what happened was not satisfying enough to them in terms of promoting a revolution. So a young couple who had been present at the Bunkerville standoff with Cliven Bundy walked into a pizza restaurant in, I believe it was in Las Vegas, and just apparently more or less randomly chose two police officers who were seated in the pizza restaurant and shot them point blank dead. And there was a civilian who tried to intervene, and that person too was shot dead. And when after the shootings, the young couple placed a flag over one of the police officers and pinned a Nazi lapel pin on him, basically saying that these people are Nazis. They draped the Gadsden flag, the yellow "Don't tread me, don't tread on me" flag, over the body of one of the police officers and pinned a note on him and said, "This is the beginning of the revolution." And so if you talk about Malheur, I think what you have to keep in mind was this was the continuation of that struggle that was begun in Bunkerville. And so what happened in the Malheur case was that the sons of Cliven Bundy, along with several key individuals, particularly a militia member from Montana named Ryan Payne, and their press person, Pete Santilli, all of whom are now in jail in the Multnomah County Detention Center in Portland, went around the western states, Oregon and other states, looking for an opportunity to, quote unquote, take a hard stand. And Malheur wasn't the only case that they looked at in Oregon even. They looked at something called the Sugar Pine Mountain standoff. That was a smaller scale confrontation that occurred in Josephine County. They went there and they went to some other places, and they decided that the best place to take a hard stand would be in Harney County. And the reason for that was because of the Hammond family. And now this is the part of the story I think that becomes more familiar to the press. The Hammond family had had a long, contentious history of interactions with the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge. Dwight Hammond, the father, and Stephen Hammond, the son, had there's very long record of their making threats of physical violence, including death threats, against workers at the refuge that goes back at least to the 1980s. They had had this very long grudge against the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge. They felt that the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge had overstepped its authority, that they didn't have constitutional rights to own that land to begin with. In other words, the same sort of ideological position that the Bundy family has. And so the Bundy family saw some kindred spirits here And they decided that they would, in a sense, use the Hammond case as an opportunity to, again, take a stand. That's the word that they used. And then they initiated a call to arms on social media. They used social media quite shrewdly and issued a number of YouTube videos that made some very emotional and inflammatory statements, most of which, in most people's opinion, including mine, were just flat out untrue. For example, Cliven Bundy released a video called "Federal Agents Burning Cows Alive." And in that video, he claimed that the Bureau of Land Management was seeking to get ranchers off of their land so that the federal government could take that land away. And the way that, according to Bundy, the way that the federal government was doing that was by deliberately starting fires and driving people off of that burnt ranchers' houses down, burnt their livestock, killed their livestock, and that I think Bundy clearly saw this as an opportunity to stimulate or exploit the anger that already existed out there in some Western communities, resentment against the federal government and so on. He intentionally stoked those flames and tried to encourage people to come to Harney County to support the Hammonds, who, in a sense, the Bundys had adopted as their cause, that they would literally rally around. How much more do you want to know?
Oh, no. Well, I mean, so this time it didn't work. They didn't succeed.
Right.
The government didn't back down. What went wrong? Where did they miscalculate?
It's a great question, and it's a very important question. The answer, in short, is that they did not understand the community that they had, in a sense, hijacked, occupied. Mm-hmm. What they didn't understand was that the Hammonds are an outlier in the community. The Hammonds aren't actually even really, in a sense, from Harney County. They came to Harney County in the mid-1960s, which by Harney County standards is pretty recent. Mm-hmm. And the Hammonds had always had a different style of interacting with the federal government than other people in Harney County, a much more confrontational style. It's not a style that's shared by most people in the community in Harney County. And I think it's very important, and to answer your question, I think it's very important to understand that Harney County is actually a celebrated case of a rural Western, ranching and timber producing community that's worked very constructively with the federal government over many years in ways that are actually quite pioneering. And Harney County, in short, the answer to your question was people in Harney County were not angry with the federal government in the way, at least to the extent of wanting to lead a armed rebellion against the federal government in the way that I think the Bundys basically assumed. I think the Bundys assumed that the Hammonds were representative, and they spoke before they took over the community and the refuge. And it's important to recall that they actually took over the community well before they took over the refuge, and I'd be very happy to talk about that. This is a very traumatic experience for the community. In October, November, December of 2015, the Bundys had, in a sense, taken over the community before they took over the refuge. But the Bundys didn't understand that the people in the community were not going to support them. Once the Bundys took over the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, they said the community should come here to support us, stand by our side, and we're going to lead the way to this new American Revolution. And the people in Harney County literally told them to go home. Literally told them to go home. I was at a meeting in the Burns High School gym on January 19th, 2016, where there were 300 or 400 people in the gym. Ammon Bundy and his colleagues came into the gym about 20 minutes into the meeting, heavily armed. Arms are not allowed in the high school gym. They were heavily armed. They had bodyguards. They tactically positioned themselves around the gym, each of the four corners of the gym. I was there. There was Ryan Bundy and John Ritzheimer, two of the co-conspirators, right behind me. Ammon Bundy was on the other side. They had snipers in the parking lot. I later spoke to the sheriff of Harney County, Dave Ward. He said that the number of armed Bundy occupiers outside the gym and inside the gym outnumbered law enforcement by 3 to 1 and had a tactical advantage, which was that they essentially had 300 or 400 people who were human shields, who they were intentionally using as human shields. And despite that, the judge, which is a word they use there, but essentially means the county commissioner, chair of the county commissioners, Steve Grasty, stood up and he said, "Mr. Bundy, we don't want you here. Go home." And the great majority, I'd say at least 3/4 of the people in the room stood up and chanted all in unison, "Go home, go home, go home." It was one of the most dramatic and courageous things I've ever seen in my life. Because keep in mind, these men were heavily armed. They had clearly stated a willingness to die for their cause. And 300 or 400 people, including the county judge, stood up and said, "Go home." I don't think that the Bundys anticipated that. I think they anticipated that the community would rally behind them. I think what they also didn't anticipate was that bringing in hundreds, they had called for thousands of outside militia members to come into the community to support their revolution. What they didn't count on was that the community really didn't like that. And I mentioned that in October, November, December, really on mostly late November and December, the community became just flooded with people who were wearing camouflage and openly carrying heavy military-grade firearms in public places, in the Safeway, the Rite Aid, and so on. And anybody who disagreed with their point of view would be verbally confronted and in some cases openly threatened. There were federal employees who had Bundy co-occupiers show up in front of their houses, just parked their cars and made showed a threatening presence. The federal agencies and some local and state law enforcement were evacuated from the community because there was a credible threat that people would be kidnapped or injured, people who didn't go along with the occupation. So the answer to your question is I think the Bundys simply didn't understand the community that they had attempted to take over, and the community had no interest in their revolution and was willing to literally stand and say, "Go home." So they got no support. And think about it this way. The Bundys were asking for literally thousands of people to go to the refuge and support their cause. Had that happened, had the community gone to the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in the hundreds or thousands and stood by the Bundys, law enforcement would have had a problem unlike anything that it's ever encountered in the United States in our history. That was exactly what the Bundys were counting on, and it was exactly what the community refused to go along with.
So I would assume that your view is that though this particular confrontation, by all measures, was a failure,
Yes.
in the terms that the Bundys were hoping for, I assume your view is that this movement is not going away.
Not
that is
at
to
all.
say, you anticipate that sometime in the future there will be another such event.
Yes.
And it might well be the case that the next time they will have learned from the miscalculations in this particular case.
Yes, absolutely. In about the last 8 years, in the period that's roughly the period from which Barack Obama was elected President of the United States, the amount of activity and membership in anti-federal organizations, so-called patriot militia groups, so-called constitutional sheriffs movements, and so on, have just grown by tenfold. And those people are now more active than at any other time in modern history. And we've seen that actually in, for example, in Grant County here in Oregon, where the sheriff, Glenn Palmer, claims to be a so-called constitutional sheriff, which is interesting because the word sheriff doesn't actually appear anywhere in the U.S. Constitution. But Glenn Palmer, for example, has declared that he is the highest authority in the county, and that he, in fact, is a higher authority than the President of the United States, and that federal agencies operating in his county can be told basically that they're in violation of his laws, and he can put them in prison at will. In other words, he's declaring what's called county supremacy over the federal government. And Glenn Palmer is far from alone. There's a man named Richard Mack, a former sheriff from Arizona, who's leading an active campaign to encourage other sheriffs around the country, and he has a list of quite a few of them. The number is disputed, but possibly hundreds or thousands of sheriffs who've declared that they too are constitutional sheriffs, in effect carrying out this armed revolution against the federal government in rural counties all over the western states. So yes, absolutely, this is not the end of the story.
So we have 1 minute left. What single piece of advice would you give to the incoming President of the United States, whoever that's going to be, about how to address this simmering problem? 1 minute. What's your advice?
Learn from Harney County's success. Harney County worked for decades to work out, at the beginning of our interview, we noted that public land creates a huge benefit to a lot of people, recreation, economic benefits, and so on, but it also creates a political problem. How do you jointly manage that jointly inherited estate that we all own as Americans? And Harney County, because there's inevitably going to be tension. Ranchers have different objectives than environmentalists. That's inevitable. But Harney County has figured out ways to work together through collaborative agreements. There's something, for example, called the High Desert Partnership, which was established in 2005, intentionally to try to resolve those kinds of tensions on public lands. And they've been very successful. And the fact that they were successful meant that when the Bundys came to their community, the community said, we're just not that angry. Things are working out okay. You can go home now.
Thank you very much for that piece of advice. I hope the next president heeds it. Thank you, Peter, for taking the time to speak with us today.
My pleasure.
I've been speaking with Peter Walker, Professor of Geography and Environmental Studies at the University of Oregon. Walker spent 5 weeks going back and forth between Eugene and Harney County to witness firsthand the occupation of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, January 2nd through February 11th, 2016. Thank you for watching.